Emily stood in front of her son's grave, her hands trembling as she clutched the letter. The wind whispered through the trees, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the words scrawled in David's handwriting. Words that made no sense, words that shouldn't exist. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but I need you to do something for me. A year after my funeral, dig up my grave. You'll find the truth there. Trust me. I love you. David." Emily's heart raced. David had been dead for almost a year now. She had buried him herself, watched as the casket was lowered into the ground. She had grieved, cried, and tried to move on. But this letter, it had arrived in the mail today, postmarked just a week ago. How was that possible? She looked around the cemetery, half expecting someone to jump out and tell her this was some cruel joke. But the place was empty, silent except for the rustling leaves. Her mind raced with questions. Who had sent this? Why would David ask her to do something so horrifying? And what truth could possibly be buried in his grave? Emily's hands shook as she folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She couldn't ignore it. This was her son, her only child. If there was even a chance that this was real, she had to know. But the thought of digging up his grave made her stomach churn. It felt wrong, sacrilegious. Yet, the letter had said to trust him, and David had never been one to joke about something like this. She took a deep breath and made up her mind. She would do it. She would dig up his grave and find out what he meant. But first, she needed help. She couldn't do this alone. Emily pulled out her phone and dialed the only person she could think of, her brother, Mark. He answered on the second ring. "Mark, I need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about David." There was a pause on the other end. "Emily, what's going on? You sound strange." "I can't explain over the phone. Just come to the house, please. It's urgent." Mark agreed, and Emily hung up. She took one last look at David's grave, her heart heavy with a mix of fear and hope. Whatever she was about to uncover, it would change everything. She could feel it in her bones. Mark arrived at Emily's house within the hour. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Mark frowned as he sat down across from her. "Emily, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, his voice filled with concern. She pushed the letter toward him without a word. Mark picked it up and read it, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. When he finished, he looked up at her, his eyes wide. This can't be real," he said slowly. "David's been dead for almost a year. Who sent this? And why?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know, but it's his handwriting, Mark. I'd recognize it anywhere. And the postmark, it's recent. Someone sent this just a week ago." Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make any sense. If David's alive, why would he wait a year to contact you? And why ask you to dig up his grave? It's insane." "I know," Emily whispered. "But what if it's true? What if he's trying to tell me something? I can't just ignore this." Mark sighed, his mind racing. "Okay, let's say for a moment that this is real. What's the plan? You can't just go digging up a grave in the middle of the night. It's illegal, for one thing. And if someone sees us—" "I know it's risky," Emily interrupted. "But I have to do this. I need to know the truth, and I can't do it alone. Please, Mark, I need your help." Mark stared at her for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but we need to be careful. If we're going to do this, we need a plan." Over the next hour, they worked out the details. They would wait until late at night when the cemetery was empty. Mark would bring tools, a shovel, a crowbar, and a flashlight. Emily would keep watch while he did the digging. They would be quick in and out, and hopefully no one would notice. As the sun set and the house grew dark, Emily's anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something terrible. But she had no choice. She had to know. The cemetery was eerily quiet as Emily and Mark approached David's grave. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, making sure they were alone. "All right," Mark whispered, setting down the tools. Let's get this over with. He picked up the shovel and started digging, the sound of metal hitting dirt echoing in the stillness. Emily stood nearby, her eyes darting around nervously. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound made her jump. She felt like they were being watched, though she couldn't see anyone. The deeper Mark dug, the more tense the air became. Emily's hands were clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She kept glancing at the grave, half expecting something to happen, something terrible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark's shovel hit something solid. He paused, looking up at Emily with wide eyes. "I think I've reached the casket," he said quietly. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak. Mark set the shovel aside and picked up the crowbar. With a deep breath, he pried open the lid of the casket. The sound of wood creaking filled the air and Emily's stomach churned. She forced herself to look inside, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. But what she saw made her blood run cold. The casket was empty. Emily stared into the empty casket, her mind reeling. Her legs felt weak and she stumbled back, clutching her chest as if to steady her racing heart. Mark stood frozen, his face pale in the dim light of the flashlight. This can't be," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Where is he? Where's David?" Mark shook his head, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. "I don't know, but this changes everything. If the casket's empty, it means he was never buried here. But we saw them lower it into the ground. We were at the funeral, Emily. How is this possible?" Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. She remembered the funeral vividly, the casket, the flowers, the mourners. She had watched as it was lowered into the ground. How could it be empty now? And if David wasn't here, where was he? "The letter," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said we'd find the truth here. But this isn't the truth. This is just more questions." Mark knelt beside the open casket, shining the flashlight inside. He ran his hand along the smooth satin lining, as if searching for some clue. Then he paused, his fingers brushing against something small and metallic. "Emily, look at this," he said, holding up the object. It was a key, a small rusted key with a number etched into it. Emily took it from him, turning it over in her hands. Her heart skipped a beat. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Where did it come from?" "It was tucked into the lining of the casket," Mark replied. "It's like someone left it here for us to find." Emily's mind raced. A key, a number. It had to mean something. But what? And who had left it there? Was it David or someone else? "We need to figure out what this key opens," she said, her voice firm now. "This is the clue David wanted us to find. It has to be." Mark nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "All right, but we can't stay here. If someone finds us like this, we're in serious trouble. Let's cover this up and get out of here. We'll figure out the next step at home." Emily hesitated, her eyes lingering on the empty casket. She felt a mix of emotions, fear, confusion, but also a glimmer of hope. If David wasn't here, maybe he was still alive. Maybe this was his way of reaching out to her. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay, let's go." Back at the house, Emily and Mark sat at the kitchen table, the key lying between them. The number etched into it, 247, was clear, but its meaning was a mystery. Emily turned the key over and over in her hands, as if hoping it would suddenly reveal its secrets. "It has to be a locker or a safe deposit box," Mark said, breaking the silence. "Something with a number like that. But where? And who does it belong to?" Emily frowned, her mind racing. "David never mentioned anything like this. He didn't have a locker or a safe deposit box that I know of, but maybe it's not his. Maybe it's someone else's." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "If David left this for us, he must have known we'd figure it out. He wouldn't just leave us with a dead end. There has to be a way to trace this key." Emily's eyes lit up. "What about his things? After he died, I packed up his apartment. Maybe there's something there, a clue, a note, anything that could tell us what this key is for." Mark nodded. "It's worth a shot. Do you still have his stuff?" "Yes. Emily said, standing up. It's all in the basement. I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Together they went down to the basement, where boxes of David's belongings were stacked against the wall. Emily opened the first box, her hands trembling as she sifted through his clothes, books, and personal items. It felt like an invasion of his privacy, but she pushed the guilt aside. She had to know the truth. After what felt like hours, Mark called out from across the room. "Emily, look at this." She hurried over to where he was standing, holding a small leather-bound journal. It was worn and faded, with David's initials embossed on the cover. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "I forgot he kept a journal," she said, taking it from him. "He used to write in it all the time, but he never let anyone read it." She opened the journal, flipping through the pages. Most of the entries were mundane, thoughts, observations, snippets of his daily life. But as she reached the last few pages, her breath caught in her throat. The entries changed. The handwriting became messier, more frantic. The tone shifted from casual to desperate. And then she saw it. A single sentence that made her blood run cold. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but I'm not dead. I had to disappear. They're after me. Mom, if you find this, use the key. It's the only way to stop them." Emily's hands shook as she read the words aloud. Mark's face turned pale. "Who's after him?" he asked, his voice tense. "What did he get himself into?" Emily flipped to the next page, but it was blank. The journal ended there, leaving them with more questions than answers. She closed the book, her mind racing. "We need to find out what this key opens," she said firmly. "Whatever David was involved in, it's not over. And if he's still out there, we need to find him." The next morning, Emily and Mark began their search for the locker the key might open. They started with the most obvious place, the local bank where David used to have an account. The manager, a middle-aged woman with a polite smile, listened as Emily explained their situation. "We found this key among my son's belongings," Emily said, holding it up. "We think it might be for a safe deposit box or a locker. Could you check if it belongs here?" The manager examined the key, her brow furrowing. "This isn't one of ours," she said after a moment. "Our keys have a different design, but I can check our records to see if David had a box with us." She typed something into her computer, then shook her head. "No, I'm sorry. There's no record of a safe deposit box under his name." Emily's heart sank, but she forced a smile. "Thank you for checking." As they left the bank, Mark sighed. "This is going to be harder than we thought. If it's not here, where else could it be?" Emily thought for a moment, then snapped her fingers. "What about the train station? David used to travel a lot for work. Maybe he rented a locker there." It was a long shot, but they had no other leads. They drove to the train station and approached the information desk. The attendant, a young man with a bored expression, barely looked up as they explained what they were looking for. "We're trying to find out if this key opens a locker here," Mark said, showing him the key. The attendant glanced at it, then shrugged. "We don't use keys like that anymore. All our lockers are electronic now. But you can check the old storage area in the basement. Some of the older lockers might still be there." Emily and Mark exchanged a look, then followed the attendant's directions to the basement. The storage area was dimly lit and smelled of dust and mildew. Rows of old, rusted lockers lined the walls, most of them covered in cobwebs. "This is going to take forever," Mark muttered, shining his flashlight along the rows. But Emily was already moving, her eyes scanning the numbers on the lockers. She stopped suddenly, her heart racing. "Mark, look." She pointed to a locker near the back of the room. The number on it was 247. Mark hurried over, his flashlight illuminating the rusty metal door. Emily's hands trembled as she inserted the key into the lock. For a moment it didn't budge. Then, with a loud click, the lock turned. Emily pulled the door open, her breath catching in her throat. Inside the locker was a single, unmarked envelope. She reached in and took it, her fingers shaking as she opened it. Inside was a stack of documents, bank statements, photographs, and a handwritten note. Emily unfolded the note and read it aloud. "Mom, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this, but I had no choice. The people I was involved with, they're dangerous. I faked my death to protect you, but I couldn't leave without giving you the truth. The documents in this envelope will explain everything. Be careful, they're still out there, and they'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Mark. "He's alive. He's really alive." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "But if he's in danger, we need to figure out what's going on. Let's take these documents and get out of here. We'll go through them at home." Back at the house, Emily and Mark spread the documents out on the kitchen table. The photographs showed David with a group of men Emily didn't recognize. They looked rough, dangerous. The bank statements revealed large sums of money being transferred in and out of an account in David's name. But it was the final document that made Emily's blood run cold. It was a contract, a deal between David and a man named Victor Crane. The terms were vague, but the implications were clear. David had been involved in something illegal, something that had put him in over his head. "Victor Crane," Mark muttered, his face pale. "I've heard that name before. He's a known criminal. Drugs, smuggling, you name it. If David was mixed up with him..." Emily's hands clenched into fists. "We need to find him. If David's in danger, we have to help him." Mark nodded, but his expression was troubled. "It's not going to be easy. If Crane's involved, this is bigger than we thought. We need to be careful." Emily's mind raced as she stared at the documents. She thought about the empty casket, the key, the journal. David had gone to great lengths to protect her, but now it was her turn to protect him. "We'll start with Crane," she said firmly. "If we can find him, we can find David." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we need a plan. We can't just walk into this blind." As they began to plot their next move, Emily felt a surge of determination. She didn't know what they were up against, but she wasn't going to back down. David was out there, and she was going to find him, no matter what it took.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.